And then Paul writes this, but what saith the answer of God unto him? How did God respond to this prayer of Elijah? Did he say, Elijah, you are dead right? You can't see it now, but lightning has struck every single person in the northern kingdom. What did he respond? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Or to use the language of verse 2, in the midst of apostate Israel, there were some whom I foreknew, some that I've loved, even in the midst of them. You don't know them all, you've never met them, but I know them. I have known them before the foundation of the world, and they're the 7,000. You didn't know there were that many, Elijah, but there are 7,000. 7 being the covenant number, and 1,000 being 10 to the power of 3, 10 cubed, 10 times 10 times 10, with 10 being the number of completeness. I have a complete covenant people saved, foreknown, out of apostate Israel, despite all their wickedness. And you shouldn't have been playing God and telling me how many were saved and how many weren't. And you shouldn't have been despairing and thinking that my work was finished, because you're just a prophet. You just scurry along in the earth and do what you're told. And I'm in heaven, and I choose, and I govern the church, and you don't. Now, get back on your feet and stop crying off and get back to work. And you'll remember how it was that God told Elijah this. He didn't come through the wind. He didn't come through the earthquake. He didn't come through the fire. He came with the still, small voice, the little whisper. That explains it. Now Elijah's got it straight. Now, back to work and quit crying. This work of God in reserving 7,000 to himself means that I have elected them to myself as my peculiar inheritance and possession in Jesus Christ. I have called them to myself through the Word. I have preserved them to myself, and I have preserved them in a holy walk. These people are faithful, godly believers, and we know that because the text says God has preserved them to himself in love, and they don't bow the knee to the image of Baal. They're not engaged in this idolatry. They're living separate, holy lives in a very difficult situation in an apostate northern kingdom. And that's the wonder of grace. The wonder of grace. And that brings us finally to the general principle. Has God cast away the Jews? First, the vehement negative. God forbid. He hasn't. Then a reference to himself as a personal instance to the contrary. Well, I'm an Israelite. I believe I'm a Jewish Christian. Then Paul more precisely states the question, God hath not cast away his people whom he foreknew. He has cast away the people whom he did not foreknow and love, but he hasn't cast away those whom he foreknew. And then the classic historical example, didn't you learn it in catechism, so to say, what about the 7,000 in Elijah's day? And from all this, the apostle gathers the general principle of verse 10, even so then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. There's a believing few out of the many. There's a believing few out of the many who claim to be God's people. And the rest don't even claim to be God's people. But even of those who do claim to be God, there's just a few of them who truly believe. And they are the remnant according to the election of grace. And this explains the existence of the remnant, God's eternal election. But for that election, no remnant, nothing at all. God's eternal election explains why there is a remnant. It's not man's free will or works. The text doesn't say, even so at this present time there is a remnant, because there's some really good people out there who've pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and remained faithful. It says, and here it goes to the deepest ground, there's a remnant according to the election of grace. Gracious election. explains the existence of the remnant, because it's a remnant according to the election of grace. And this gracious election means that those whom God chose and foreknew, them he sends Jesus Christ to shed his blood for. To Christ he imputes their sins, and then Christ imputes to them his righteousness. Oh, even so. Even so, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. In Elijah's day, 800 years or so BC, even when things looked darkest, even when things looked darkest in the eyes of the one man you'd have expected to have gotten it straight, Elijah, the best man of the day, he thought it was finished. But there was a remnant. In Paul's day, in the 1st century AD, at this present time also, Paul says, there's a remnant. After the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, after the terrible apostasy of Israel in rejecting the Messiah and rejecting too the preaching of the apostles, Paul says, even so, not just then, 800 years ago, even so, at this present time also, there's a remnant according to the election of grace. You thought things were bleak among the Jews in Elijah's day in the northern kingdom. They're just as bleak now, but in both instances, there's a remnant according to the election of grace. This passage is referring, the whole context screams at this, is referring to a remnant according to the election of grace within the Jews. Within the Jews. And this is the case right through the New Testament age, right through the last 2,000 years. I'm not going to bog you down with examples, just a few chosen ones. But in the early church there was a man called Justin Martyr. He was an apologist, and as the name would indicate, he was a martyr, and he was a Jew. He was a Jew in the early church. I've got a book to review at the minute on a man called Tremellius. And he was a 16th century Reformed theologian who was a converted Jew. There you are. Even so, at this time also, there's a remnant of Jews according to the election of grace. There's a famous commentator, at least some of you may be familiar with him, Franz Delitzsch, a German Lutheran of Jewish extraction, Bible commentator. Even so, at this time also, a remnant according to the election of grace. And then we have Alfred Edersheim in England. Some of you may have some of his books on your shelves. An Anglican who was a Jew who wrote The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. Those four, but you get the point. And we could have used more. There has always been, in the history of the Christian church, and this probably can't be said of any other nation or people group, there has always been Jews, believing Jews in the Christian church. God always has been saving some Jews right through the New Testament period, and he will do right until the very end. And this is why, or at least this is one good reason why, in his providence the Jewish people still continue to this day. We don't think about it, but many, many nations have, and people groups cease to exist. We don't say, well, so-and-so's a Moabite. Oh, have you heard of the resurgence of the Philistines? They're gone. But the Jews, there are still Jews, and that's why God has made them, one reason why he's made them be persecuted. Why they've kept an identity, even though they've been scattered amongst the nations of the earth, because God wills to keep a separate Jewish people so that then he can save some out of it and fulfill his promise, so that even so at this time also there's a remnant among the Jews according to the election of grace. There's always some of the physical seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being saved.